Plugin of the week comes from the Plugin Alliance. It's the Fiedler Audio Stage. This is a plugin that I think was originally designed more for mastering work, or its origins come from more of a mastering perspective on dealing with audio. But it's actually an incredibly cool way of adding like some depth, presence, and some dimensionality to any kind of thing. So what I have is this plugin set up on some drums just on the stem so we can kind of hear it, and I'll show you a little bit about what it does and how it works. Essentially, it's a sound field plugin, and so it all starts here with an input gain stage. No big deal there. You have a tilt, so if you have a stereo signal, this will allow you to essentially balance out the left-right of the signal. So it just kind of goes plus minus 6 dB, basically a 12 dB range going across. It also has an MS set up here, so if you bring this in, you can lean it more towards mono, or push the balance more towards, or all towards the side, and you'd have a pure side signal. So depending upon what the source signal is like, you can spread it a little wider, narrow it down, and mono it up. And essentially what happens is when we run through this, you can feed this directly to the output, and then you'll have an effect chain that will run parallel to all of this. Okay, so so the routing kind of works this way, and you can kind of see exactly what's going on. So you'll notice that the signal will split, and it will go into a kind of panned section here with a width control. And when you're working with this, this is actually feeding into an ambient section, which we'll kind of get to. So it's somewhat delay-based, phase delay-based type of work, but the clarity with which they've gone through the process of working with it, and just how pure and musical it is kind of really where I think it stands above most of what else you'll find out there in terms of phase or spatial enhancement type of plugins. There's also a color section here, so this allows you to kind of tune the overall tonal character. There's an ambient section here. We'll go into this, which has a modulation section. There's phase inversion switches on the speakers that you see here. So we'll get into a little bit of that. So what we have in this pan section is we have a pan, and what it allows us to do is to kind of move our, in this case, our wet signals to each other. If I keep this out of bypass here, then what will happen is it'll pan both sides. I also have a width control, so this allows me to kind of balance in my stereo imaging here. Now, what essentially I have here is the signal that is feeding into the ambient effect. Okay, so what will happen is if I do any other adjustments with the panning outside of what I've done here with the tilt and the MS, then it will go through this processing and then go to the dry output. Okay, so we haven't enabled the wet output yet. If I bypass it here, then it will just, our signal after our MS and tilt processing will go straight to the output. So that's the basic idea there. And then this signal, regardless, will feed into the ambience effect, and we'll start to kind of play with that. So let's start by listening just to a short bit of some of the audio, and then we'll and then I'll start to show you what the processing does. Okay, so now I'll take this out of bypass, and so we're listening only to the dry signal. So this is the MS, which will move it more towards that setting. And it's amazing, like just something simple like how cleanly it moves that center image across, that phantom image across, I think is a lot of like these subtle things that make it really, really cool. All right, so let's take this out here for a second, and now we could work with this. And so this is different than the tilt control. And then I can work with it that way. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this dry now. I'm going to add the wet signal in, and this is going to add in the ambient section. So these are pretty standard basic controls. If we hit the pan invert on the wet, then what it'll do is it'll reverse the feed into the ambience. So this is the signal going into the ambient. If I incur a pan delay, again, this is a delay feed for what is going on into the ambience. So let's take a Okay, so anyway, so you could see here, so the size is just moving the speakers away. You're getting a little bit of delay. I have not added any feedback in. Where it gets kind of interesting here is if I just phase invert one of the sides, now I can... Now I can start to create some width processing. Now I have a wet separate gain control here, so I can blend this in. So if I decided I wanted to mix in that much, let's just hear the difference of what these two are. It's bypassed. So I can set that here. Now, there's an interesting things that we can do with this when I start to bring in the feedback. So I'm getting some fluttering. Alright, so let's go back. So what I do is enhancing the kind of existing program material. And essentially, I'm not exactly what is under the hood and the way that they do this, but essentially it's a delay-based system. So obviously you get that delay of the original signal. So the enhancement in the depth field and the width field, especially by flipping the phase here and applying the feedback, helps to create layers that will expand beyond what the original program material is. Obviously, if you use this on an individual track, and I'll show an example of this as well with a different instrument, you can see how you can start to get really creative with it. And most of that comes from the LFO department here. So we'll kind of play around with that in a little bit. But let's start with a color here, because this ambience can also start to get a little bit cold depending upon the original program material, or a little bit dull. And so this with the color section here, we have brilliance, which is sort of a high frequency equalization, presence, which is more or less in the upper mids, body, which is a mid-range, just to kind of give some solidity, and bass for the low end, and there's a plus minus on both. So I can add it in a warm way. bass. So let's go back, A-B it. So you get a sense here, and now as I start to play with this and I move the size inward, I can tighten it up, make it a little bit tighter, but that depth field is really amazing on this, and this color section is really powerful. It's very musical EQ, however they apply that's the filter shapes and all of that. There's also the low frequency section, an LFO filter, and this is actually kind of cool. There's a lot of ways that you can use this, and this is where we start to have a little bit of fun with it here. So I'm just going to copy this from A here, just so we have the original section here. So you have undo, redo. You can save and load presets. There are some presets that actually are factory presets that come from here. Which you can set up. Again, you have the copy A-B thing, so that's basically the header of it. And let's see. So with the frequency, you see I'm modulating it here. Now, if I have a phase spread, what that does, you'll see, is that it'll move one side in as it's moving the other side outward, right? So you could see it, let me see if I could get a frequency here. It's a little bit slower. There you go. Whereas if I go phase normal, then they'll both kind of move in and out together. So that adds like a variable in on the ambient section. So you can hear how that really opens up the pan field. So I want to show you one other quick thing, because you can get really creative with this particular type of effect. And so I'm just going to open this up over here. And this is just a simple Rhodes track here. So this is a kind of mono to stereo instantiation here. And so let me just zoom in here. So okay, all right, so let's take this out. Just to give you an idea, I was playing around with some stuff here, so I'll kind of set it up or tighten it up a little bit. So right now I have the pan delay in, so everything is going through this. I have the wet gain up a little bit higher. I'll probably back that off just a little bit. You could also do this if you turn off the dry signal. You could do it in a send return configuration. I'm putting it all together here. So let's take the feedback out here for a second. inverts the pan because it's a mono input. I'm not sure it makes a difference. And I'm going to leave some of these other basic controls open here. So bring it a little tighter. And if I add in the overall, let me just see here if I take this down a little bit, an overall level. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is bring in the LFO section. And just a little bit more. So you can get a lot of tonal movement. It gives you more of a Doppler type of effect as you get the modulation to move more. Or you can get a little bit more left-right movement by doing the phase spread. And of course you have the color section, and you could blend this in with the original. So you can create some sort of more like ambient type of modulation, movement type effects on it as well. It's a really an amazing, simple plugin that's actually really powerful. Has some really unique sounds, ways that you can kind of work with it, and just graphically, it's easy to understand what is going on with it. The controls are pretty straightforward, and the sound of it is really amazing. And that was kind of what really drew me to this plugin, just as like an acoustic enhancement, which is basically more or less the name of the plugin. So a new one from Plugin Alliance, very cool, very interesting one. I haven't experimented with this so much, well, at least as of this video, on the mastering side of things, but in a much more subtle way. This can actually be a really cool way of adding depth on that end. Maybe it's worth another video. But Plugin of the Week, Plugin Alliance, Fiedler Audio Stage.